Okay. We're carrying on here. Now, last week, we looked at a number of passages in the New Testament that declare that the Old Testament speaks of Jesus, but which don't specify what it says about him. In other words, we first looked at a lot of texts that said the Old Testament talks about Jesus in the specific way of referring to his suffering, death, and resurrection, and to the need for faith in him. Last week we looked at texts that say, well, the Old Testament refers to Jesus without specifying that it refers to him in the particulars of his suffering, death, and resurrection, and in putting faith in him. So in other words, more general sense that the Old Testament just bears witness to him generally. And we're now looking at the Old Testament texts that I think fall in that category, that refer to Jesus without referring specifically to suffering, death, resurrection, or the need to put faith in him. And the first text that we looked at in that regard is Genesis 3:15, where after Adam and Eve sinned, God says to the serpent or to the snake, he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring, or your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, I went through this last week, but just kind of to race through it again and remind you of my take on it, is that I suggested to you that God's putting enmity and hostility between the snake's descendants and Eve's descendants, that was a reference to his cursing of creation in response to humanity's sin by having snakes become dangerous and even deadly. And that conflict between humans and snakes serves as a perpetual and stark representation and reminder of the larger conflict between humans and physical creation that was introduced into the world by the Satan-induced rebellion against God. All right, so that's how I see that. It epitomizes, that conflict between humans and snakes epitomizes that conflict with creation, that consequence of Satan's work, and thus it also symbolizes Satan's opposition to mankind. Now, when we ended, I was noting that others understand that first part of 3:15 differently. There are quite a few people who see that conflict between the snake's descendants and Eve's descendants as a reference to the conflict between ungodly humanity, who are figuratively offspring of Satan in that they manifest his conduct and character. So they look at it as a conflict between ungodly offspring and godly humanity, those who are in a relationship with God. So I'm aware of that understanding, and I explained to you briefly, I'm just not persuaded by it. And the two things that really kind of steer me away from it is that in just a few verses in 3:20, it says that Eve is the mother of all the living. So she's the mother of all humans, and it just seems odd if the intent is to say that she is the representative of a subset of humanity, the godly lineage, that just in 3:20 it says she's the mother of all the living. But also this thing comes in the context of a judgment. It is a curse. It is a judgment that was initiated by Eve's rebellion. So I'm just not persuaded that's the right understanding. But either way, people who look at that way, we're still in accord on the part I'm focusing on. We're in accord on the second part there, that it's an allusion to the Lord's victory over Satan. It's promised there in that second part where it says, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. It's promised that a male descendant of the woman, I mentioned that he is singular. I understand the idea of a collective, but I think here you need to focus on the singular. He is singular, and that this male descendant of a woman will defeat the serpent himself, not the serpent's descendants, because the you is singular there also. So we're in agreement on that, though. So whatever the disagreement is, I'm suggesting one reading of the first part to you. I give you the other reading, tell you why I'm not buying that one. But we're agreed that the second part is this idea about that there is a promise of a male descendant who is going to defeat the serpent, Satan himself. And that victory is implicit in the fact, says, well, it doesn't say he's going to be victorious. No, but it says that he is going to bruise the serpent's head, whereas the serpent's only going to bruise his heel. And you can also render bruise as strike or crush. So what does it picture? The picture is stomping his head. Okay, so the victory is implicit in the image of heel and head, right? So you would say that he crushes or strikes or bruises the head of the serpent, whereas the serpent only crushes or strikes or bruises his heel. Now that's also significant because the victory comes at a price. There is a price to be paid in this victory. The male descendant's heel is bruised or struck or crushed. And notice that the price is paid by this male descendant, is paid by the champion of humanity. Not by humanity generally. This is his fight. This is his victory. And so all of that's wrapped up in here. And that's why this is known as the proto-evangelium, the first gospel. It's all latent here, implicit here. Now, I want to carry on, and these other Old Testament texts that refer generally to Jesus, I've grouped 3 of them here. This veiled statement in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that a man, a descendant of Eve, that he would win the ultimate victory over Satan, it's now narrowed in Genesis chapter 12 by God's election of Abraham. God's call of Abraham. He calls Abraham and then he enters into a covenant with him wherein he promises to bless him with a multitude of descendants living securely in a bountiful homeland. That living securely in a bountiful homeland, by the way, that is a picture or a type for a redeemed creation. But he promises Abraham that he's going to bless all the nations of the world through him. You see, through Abraham, he's going to bless all the nations of the world. Of all the people, of all the nations that you have, you've got people all over the place. He's going to bless all of mankind through this, all the nations, through a descendant of Abraham. You see, the ultimate servant who's going to bless all the nations of the world through the defeat of Satan. You say, here's this in 3:15, we have this picture. There's going to be this male descendant who is going to crush Satan. And who's going to be blessed and benefited by that? The world. Now we get to Genesis chapter 12, and this is narrowed down. Who of all of these descendants of Eve is going to do this? Well, whoever it is, he's going to come through the lineage of Abraham. He's going to come through the lineage of Abraham. Now, scrutinizing the wording of one or more of these Genesis texts, there are several texts that talk about through Abraham we're going to have all the nations be blessed. Paul's looking at one of those. I think he's probably looking at Genesis 22, 17, and 18. But scrutinizing the wording of one or more of those Genesis texts, Paul notes in Galatians 3:16, and we looked at this when we went through Galatians, Paul notes there that seed is singular rather than plural. And though that's the singular noun seed, it certainly can be a collective noun that refers to multiple descendants. And when you speak of it that way, you just talk about descendants. It can refer that way, but Paul reveals here in Galatians 3:16 that there's a sense in which this singular form, the one that's being used there, that this singular form focuses on a specific descendant of Abraham, the seed. So Paul picks that up and he says here that here you need to recognize that there is an element of the singular that you need to recognize as pointing toward a singular individual. It is pointing toward this seed, the descendant to whom the promises were spoken. And he identifies that descendant as the Lord Jesus Christ. He's the seed by whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed. He promises that to Abraham, and then he says, Paul tells us, down here, the seed is going to be the one through whom that's going to happen. He's the one through whom the nations will be blessed, rather than all of the descendants of Abraham. He's the doorway through which the promises that were spoken to Abraham become applicable to a worldwide people. And you see this idea in Galatians 3:6-9 and 29. We talked about this whenever it was. It wasn't too long ago we did Galatians. It says here, he says, consider Abraham. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. You know then that those of faith are the sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would pronounce the Gentiles outside of the lineage of Abraham, he's going to pronounce the Gentiles, the nations of the world, that he would pronounce the Gentiles righteous by faith, declared the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed in you. So then, those of faith in Jesus Christ are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. And if, verse 29, if you belong to Christ, then you're Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. So Paul sees this applying, and you see that also in Romans chapter 4, 13 and 17. So we have Genesis 3:15 that says, there's a male descendant coming who is going to win this victory over Satan, the beneficiaries of which will be all the nations of the earth. It doesn't spell that out, but that's implicit in the idea Satan is the foe of mankind. You defeat Satan, and you have blessed mankind. Genesis chapter 12, he says to Abraham, Abraham, through you, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. He picks up this generic promise and narrows it to a descendant of Abraham. And then, of course, we see the narrowing that continues. The narrowing continues. The line is further traced through Abraham's son Isaac, Isaac's son Jacob, who's also called Israel, and Jacob's son Judah. You see the lineage. So you have a person here, and he has offspring, and they have offspring, and offspring, and offspring. But it's being traced through specific individuals. Everybody else is being cut away as possible ancestors of the coming victor, the coming anointed one, the coming Messiah. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah. So this one who's coming is not only going to be an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham through Jacob, he's going to be a descendant of the tribe of Judah. So we're getting quite specific here with this. And Jesus, of course, is from the tribe of Judah. Right? This is declared in the genealogies of the Lord in Matthew chapter 1 and in Luke chapter 3 that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But also you see the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 7:14, for it is evident that our Lord descended from Judah. Revelation chapter 5, verse 5, Jesus is called what? The Lion of the tribe of Judah. Okay, so we're talking about, well, what are these general references to Christ in the Old Testament? Things that aren't specific to his suffering, death, resurrection, to the need for faith in him. Well, here's one of them. It is his lineage. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah. And you have to recognize how important that is in cutting out all of these other people. So here he comes. Well, it just so happens that Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. It just so happens that way. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time. I want to do an excursus, a side trip here, and talk about the genealogies in Matthew and Luke, because I suspect that you read those sometimes and you go, what in the world's going on? How do I make sense of what's happening here? Now, the genealogy of Jesus in Luke chapter 3, verses 23 to 38, it goes from Adam to Jesus in reverse order. Okay, in other words, it begins with Jesus, son of, as was supposed, Joseph, and then goes son of, son of, son of, son of, son of. Okay? And then in Matthew, the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, 1 to 16 goes only from Abraham to Jesus. Okay? So you have from Jesus in reverse order down to Adam in Luke. Matthew, you go from Abraham to Jesus in what would be considered a more chronological order, begat, 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 instead of son of, son of, son of. Okay, so what I want to do, I'm going to reverse the genealogy in Luke so it's consistent with how it's given in Matthew, and then we'll look at them and look at the two genealogies as they compare. And so, since only Luke has from Adam down to Terah, because Matthew begins with Abraham. So here is what Luke says in the genealogy. Adam, Seth, Enosh, all the way down, start next column, Shem. And the only question here really is Canaan. And Canaan, I suspect, and I think is probably a textual error. In other words, the text there, it's probably the original of the Gospel of Luke, probably didn't have Canaan there. And you say, well, why would you say that? Well, one of the oldest manuscripts, P75, which is a papyrus manuscript, doesn't have it. One of the very well-known manuscripts, a 5th century manuscript, D it's called, doesn't have it. And there's a good reason there's a rationale for seeing how it would have been miscopied. Okay, so there's a textual issue there. Some people argue about it and they say, no, Canaan's original. Others think, no, Canaan's probably a textual error and the correct text should omit that. Okay, I'm with the people who think the correct text probably should omit it, but that's just a textual issue. What did the Spirit originally say? And so that's a debatable point right there. I think not. Others say so, but that's not an issue. We have Adam down here to Terah. But we get a few more. So when we pick up now with Abraham, they overlap. Right? We get to the next section, Abraham to David. You have here both Matthew 1 and Luke 3 give us Abraham to David. And those, what they give us, they match. Now, they match with a couple other textual questions. Okay, there are a couple of textual questions. Luke's manuscript between Hezron and Amminadab. There are a number of manuscripts of the Gospel of Luke, ancient manuscripts, that include just what Matthew does. They include as the one between Hezron and Amminadab as Aram, which is the same as Matthew's ram. But there are other manuscripts that have other people there. Okay, so which is it? Well, there's good manuscript support for the matching Aram. In fact, that's what's taken by the New King James, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, the New International Version. So it's not anything eccentric or odd to accept, no, I think the correct reading is consistent with what we get in Matthew. All right, and you get the same thing with Salmon. Okay, Salmon, who's between Nahshon and Boaz. You have many of the manuscripts in Luke have Salmon, which matches Matthew. But there are some manuscripts that have Salah. Okay? And you say, okay, what is that? Well, Salah maybe is another way of saying Salmon. And when you say that, people say, well, why would you think you'd have different spellings? Well, just look in an English translation of the genealogies and look at the different spellings in English. That comes up because when you go from one language, like Aramaic or Hebrew, and you go into another language, you have to figure out how you want to sound these things out and put them, so it creates spelling differences. Okay? But Salmon here, you have Salmon, which is in many manuscripts. It's cited in ASV, NEB, New King James, NIV. Okay, so the only two questions really about Abraham to David, when you're comparing Matthew and Luke, they match with an argument that can be made about a textual issue about between Hezron and Amminadab, between Nahshon and Boaz. But in both of those cases, there is ample textual support to believe that the original matched what was in Matthew. Okay? So we have Only Luke is giving us from Adam down to Terah. Matthew and Luke from Abraham to David are matching. And now where do we get in with the real issues? Okay, what's the real issues that come up? Well, the real differences and the real changes, they start between David's sons to Jesus. Now that's where we get some, you see David's sons, I know this is like an eye test, but I had to get it on there to, that was the best I could do. I didn't want to go so many slides. But you see here, Solomon and Nathan, you have two different lineages, right? Luke is the blue, Matthew is the red. And you go down like this, and you see here that you come down this way. And then you continuing down, and you see all the differences. Now, you notice, I'll go back, you notice that Luke includes many more generations. That's why I skip spaces when I'm giving you Matthew, just so that you won't have Matthew all crammed up here and then Luke way down here. So I just skip spaces because Luke is giving more generations than Matthew. But you can see clearly that they are different lineages. They're different lineages now. So what's going on here? Okay, that's where the difference is. They're different lineages, and there are two reasonable ways to understand the differences. And the first of those is that Luke's genealogy may be that of Mary. Okay, that's a possibility. Now, if Mary was the daughter, where's my little pointer here? Okay, if Mary's the daughter of Heli, and she doesn't have any brothers, then her husband Joseph would be Heli's, quote, son, in the sense he would be his legal heir, pursuant to Numbers chapter 36, verses 1 to 12. Now, so Mary then, she wed within the family of David. Okay, she's a Davidic descendant. She weds Joseph, who's also in the family of David, in line with what you see in Numbers 36, to keep the property within that family. Okay, so if she has no brothers or sisters, then you would say that Joseph, her husband, is the son of Heli. In that sense, he is Heli's legal heir. So that would put us over here, and then that's how we would get that genealogy of Mary's. Okay, the problem with that is, that's possible. And there are a lot of people that think that. But the problem with it is that Luke stresses throughout the birth narrative that Joseph is a descendant of David. He never makes a point of Mary's Davidic descent. So it doesn't seem like that's what he's trying to communicate. Okay, we say, well, if you don't go the Mary route, what is a possible way of understanding these two different genealogies of Jesus? And the second possibility is that both of the genealogies are of Joseph. They're both of Joseph, but Matthew gives Joseph's bloodline, his biological descent, whereas Luke gives the lineage of Heli, his father by law. Okay, we understand the difference between bloodline and somebody's being a descendant by law, right? When you adopt somebody. I adopt somebody, that's my son. That's my daughter. Try to tell somebody who's adopted somebody that's not their son or daughter. Okay? That's my son and my daughter, but you also understand there's a sense in which there's somebody else's son or daughter in terms of bloodline. So there is a sense of they're my son or daughter by law, his son or daughter by bloodline. And that's what I'm suggesting to you is I think a better possibility for what is going on in these two genealogies. Now that would be the case. You said, how can that be? How can Joseph be the son of Heli by law and the son of Jacob by bloodline? Well, that would be the case if Jacob and Heli were brothers. Okay? And Heli married and died childless. And then Jacob fathered Joseph with Heli's widow. pursuant to the levirate marriage principles that you see in Deuteronomy 25, 5, and 6. Okay, so they're brothers. He dies without any children. Jacob then marries his widow, has Joseph by his widow. Joseph is then his legal descendant, but biological descendant of Jacob. You see, so that would work, right? That would work, and in fact, it ties in quite nicely with the way it's phrased, because in Matthew 1:16 it says Jacob begot Joseph, but Luke 3:23 says Joseph was the son of Heli by legal right. All right, well, that would fit. That would fit. Now, that scenario, for those who are tuned in, that raises a question, right? You're going to be saying, well, wait a minute. How can Jacob and Heli be brothers? How can that be possible when in Matthew 1:15 it identifies Mathan as Jacob's father, and Luke 3:23-24 identifies Mathat as Heli's father? All right, well, you got Mathan and Mathat. So how can they be brothers? They apparently have two different fathers. Well, there are a number of ways of skinning that cat. Okay, the first of which is Mathan and Mathat may be the same person, right? Because that's what I'm telling you about. Just go look at English translations of genealogies and see how they differ in how they do the spelling of names. Okay, well, maybe that's the situation. Is it just variant spellings of the same name? But even if they're two different individuals, okay, even if they're two different individuals, the statement that Mathan begat or fathered Jacob need not mean that Mathan was Jacob's literal father, his immediate ancestor. It wouldn't have to mean that. You see, that verb of begat or fathering, it can refer to a more distant ancestor. It can refer to a grandfather, a great-grandfather, a great-great-grandfather, and on and on. You see, it doesn't carry with it necessarily the sense that it's the immediate biological ancestor. You say, well, are you just making that up? No, I'm not. For example, if you look in Matthew chapter 1, verse 8, it says that Joram or Jehoram begat Uzziah without mentioning the intervening generations of Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah that you can see in 2 Kings chapter 8:25, 2 Kings 11:2, 2 Kings 14:1, 2 Chronicles 26:1. Matthew chapter 1:11 says Josiah begat Jeconiah without mentioning Jehoiakim, who was between them. And you can see that in 2 Kings 23:34, 1 Chronicles 3:16. All right, so Matthew may not be identifying Jacob's literal father. In other words, it might not be here. Mathan may be further back, and so these may be two different individuals. All right, so that would be a possibility. But even if Jacob and Heli had different fathers, okay, because remember we're talking about how can they be brothers, so that this whole Levitical marriage thing that I'm telling you about, how could that have happened? Even if Jacob and Heli had different fathers, Mathan being Jacob's father and Mathat being Heli's father, they could still be brothers. Even if they had different fathers, they could still be brothers. That would be the case if Mathan married a woman, he fathered Jacob by her, he died, and then his widow married Mathat, to whom she bore Heli. Okay, well, that would then make Jacob and Heli half-brothers by the same mother. And as such, that would be sufficient to trigger the levirate duty that he go and marry if he dies childless. So there are a number of ways of skinning that cat, and 3 of them I just gave you. And I think that's the better idea, is that one is a lineage of law through a levirate marriage, and the other is a biological descent. And then the last thing I'll mention about this is that given that the two genealogies, they're different lineages, it is curious, where did I put it? It's curious that in these two different lineages, we have a Shealtiel and a Zerubbabel in both of them. Right? I mean, that's at least curious that we have they're separate lineages, but here we have Shealtiel and Zerubbabel appearing in both of them. That is something that's curious. But between David there, we have it. Now, it's possible they're different persons. Okay? You say, well, how can that be? Well, their ancestor of Shealtiel is different. Okay? So I don't know how common that name was. You and I look at Shealtiel and we go, that's got to be a bizarro name. But it could be like, Steve or something. And so I don't know how common it is, and the fact that we have different ancestors listed for Shealtiel in the two lists, well, maybe they are different people. Okay? Perhaps Shealtiel was a common name. And you say, well, all right, well, why do we have Zerubbabel then as a descendant of Shealtiel? Well, maybe Shealtiel's a common name, and we have Luke's Shealtiel, who then, he says, well, I'm going to name my son after the more famous Zerubbabel in the Old Testament that is referred to in Matthew. So I'm Shealtiel. I'm going to name my kid Zerubbabel because there is a Shealtiel who has a son Zerubbabel who's very famous in the Old Testament. Okay, so you see, a lot of times people run across these people eager to attack the Bible, and they just say, well, this is crazy. This is crazy. This makes no sense. Obviously, Luke's different, and it's, you just got to take a deep breath and study the stuff. Think about it and see what's going on. And when you do that, invariably you learn something. You see, you learn something to say, well, that's pretty cool. You see? So I wanted to take a side road on that. There's another option, but I sense you're wearying of this, so I'm going to stop. There is another option on this thing that I could touch that said, well, there's another variable that we could introduce where there would be another levirate marriage where the women split back off with the descendants of Zerubbabel, but I'm going to stop. I've said enough on that. All right. Next one I want to look at. These Old Testament texts to which general New Testament texts refer. I grouped three of them here, 2 Samuel 7, Psalm 89, and Jeremiah 23:5. Jesus, he's not only a descendant of Abraham, through the line of Isaac, Jacob, and Judah, he's also a descendant of the great King David. He's a descendant of the great King David. Now, this is significant because just over 1,000 years after Abraham and many centuries after Isaac, Jacob, and Judah, God further narrowed the lineage of the Messiah by entering into a covenant with Israel's King David. He further narrows the lineage of the Messiah. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, God tells David that instead of David building a house for him, he's going to build a house for David, by which he meant he would establish an eternal ruling dynasty of David's descendants. The right to rule would never be removed from David's family as it had been with Saul's family. You remember, Saul lost not only the kingship, he lost the dynastic right. So the kingship was taken from his family lineage. He was taken out as king, and they lost the dynastic right. God says to David, that will never happen to you. That's something that's never going to happen to you. The right to rule would never be removed from David's family. See, as it had been with Saul. And that point is emphasized in Psalm 89. God really stresses, I'm never going to take that dynastic rulership from you. And God makes clear in 2 Samuel 7 and in Psalm 89 that he would punish David's faithless descendants. So punishment of those descendants, the fact they go into exile, isn't a breach of this promise. He says that if your children are your descendants are rebellious, I have a stipulation that they will be subject to punishment, but the right to rule will never be taken from you. So one of his descendants will always be entitled to rule on the throne. All right, you see the idea of dynastic rulership. Doesn't mean that they won't go into exile and they're sitting there. That will be punishment if they're rebellious. But the right to rule is something that will carry on. He's going to punish them, and we see that happening at number of times in Israel's history, but that's different from removing the right to rule from David's family. Those are two different things. And so that's important to grasp. Well, Jesus is the immortal descendant of David. Remember a week or so ago I talked about how in Jesus we see that this perpetual rulership is not simply dynastic by an ongoing series of descendants, but is personal. We now have the immortal Son of David who sits on the throne, the immortal descendant who has been placed by God permanently on David's throne in fulfillment of that covenant that God made with David. And you see, for example, Luke 1:32, and the Lord God will give him, Jesus, the throne of his father David. Jesus sits on David's throne. He is the descendant that God had promised, the king of Israel, who would be the descendant of David that will sit on the throne. Now, we learn that, well, what do you know? He's going to sit there forever himself because he's immortal, resurrected. Death no longer has mastery over him. All right, we see in Acts 2:30 and 31, being therefore a prophet, David, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ. He is the descendant of David who has been put on David's throne. Now that's something that's important. And you see here, Jesus is a descendant of David. I mean, the New Testament makes quite a bit of this, right? Son of David, his father David, descended from David, the offspring of David, the root and descendant of David, and all through the New Testament he's called what? The Son of David. Now that's a loaded term. When you say the Son of David, they don't simply mean, hey, he's one of the biological descendants or something like that. He is a descendant of David. No. Son of David, the Son of David. He's the Son of David. He is the son that God promised. He says, I'm going to put a son on your throne, and this particular son is going to rule in perpetuity. And that's Jesus. And so he's there and he does that. And I think that's an important thing to recognize. And you see here, Micah, I'm not going to have time to get into Micah. I'll introduce it. But I heard that bell. And I didn't care last week. I just kept talking, so maybe I'll just keep talking. I'll just keep talking till people are piling in. But let Micah 5:2. I'll talk till the bell rings, and if I don't hear it, somebody yell at me. All right, Micah. Micah prophesied in the middle of the 8th century to the beginning of 8th century BC to the beginning of the 7th century. During the reigns of a number of Judean kings, during the reigns of King Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And you can see that in Micah chapter 1, verse 1. Now, Micah, the book, it's arranged in 3 cycles. And each of the cycles, it opens with a judgment, and then it closes with a deliverance. And the judgment section of the second cycle is 3:1 to 5:15, and the judgment section there is in chapter 3, verses 1 to 12, where Micah announces that God is about to destroy Jerusalem for the sins of its magistrates, its prophets, and its priests. So here it opens, that cycle opens with this judgment. He's about to destroy Jerusalem for the sins of those people. And then Micah in chapter 4, I'm building up to chapter 5, but I want to give you a little bit about what's going on. But in chapter 4, verses 1 to 5, he turns abruptly to a vision of a hidden future. in which Jerusalem and its temple will become the center of global justice and righteousness and of international peace and prosperity. And this is a picture of Israel's future exaltation. And it's further pictured in chapter 4, verses 6 to 8, as God gathering dispersed Israel and transforming it into a strong nation over which he reigns forever. And verse 8 then focuses on this being a restoration to glory in Micah 4:8. In Micah 4:9 and 10, Micah foresees the distress that Judah will endure over a century later. He foresees the distress that Judah is going to endure over a century later in its destruction and captivity by the Babylonians. And then this travail, like birth pains, will be followed by a blessing, the working of which will include God bringing them back from exile. So that's what Micah's talking about. And in the now of verse 9, of chapter 4, verse 9, it's a proleptic perspective. It's like a preview perspective, like he puts himself in the future setting. It's a proleptic perspective of the future time of the Babylonian invasion. The now of Micah chapter 4, verse 11, probably refers to Micah's own time. His own time in which Sennacherib's, the Assyrian kings, in which Sennacherib's international horde of mercenaries was threatening Jerusalem in the time of Hezekiah. That's in 701 BC, when they shut Hezekiah in. So this is where Micah's on the scene then. Now Micah draws on that, but he doesn't provide a clear historical referent. So that image, the imagery functions in that context as a generic paradigm. Okay, it functions there as a generic paradigm for all such crises, including the ultimate battle against God's people at the end. And it depicts Israel's triumph over her attacking enemies through the power of God. I heard that bell. One more line. All right, the enemies that gather lusting to destroy God's people here at the end of Micah chapter 4, they don't realize that they've played into his hands. He's gathered them together for destruction by his people. All right, so this is in chapter 4. Now we get to chapter 5, and it's going to repeat this pattern of Micah 4, 9, and 10, and Micah 4, 11 to 13. But Lord willing, that'll come next week. Thanks for coming.